Hello, H105. So this week, we're actually going to finish and wrap up our first unit over British North America. So yay, almost done with a first unit. With this video, what I want to do as you start working on your reflection assignment and start preparing for your first test, which will be on Thursday, August 26th. More information later on that. But basically, open book, open note, essay. So nothing to stress out a whole lot about. But what I want to do with this video is to just go over and just draw your attention to some important historical trends and themes that we see during the early colonial period, or the colonial period up until roughly the 1750s, where our next unit will start. So if we're looking at British North America and the colonial period, some notable things that stand out to me are you simultaneously have this, you have the establishment and the development of democratic institutions and democratic political norms, but the way they're being implemented, the way they're being developed, the forms that they take are notably not that democratic. So, for example, throughout the colonies, we see that all of the colonies, to one degree or another, have some experience with self-government. Examples of that could be the House of Burgesses in Virginia, town meetings in New England, or even in the latter stages of the colonial period, the political dominance of colonial assemblies over royal governors because of the British policy of salutary neglect, where the assemblies were basically able to run the colonies politically, even though in theory the governors had more power. And yet, what's interesting about these systems is that there was always something kind of undemocratic about them. So again, in a lot of instances, voting rights or requirements to hold office included property ownership, meaning that you had to own a certain amount of property to be eligible to vote or hold public office. In the case of New England town meetings, initially it was church membership. If you were not a member of the Puritan Church, you could not vote. But as time went on, again, that shifted to property and wealth requirements. Other notable democratic norms where in practice, the colonies were egalitarian, meaning that by and large, there weren't major social divisions. At least you didn't have the entrenched nobility that you had back in Europe in the colonies. In theory, there were no hard and fast, explicit social classes and ranks, with lower classes having to practice deference and have certain norms and etiquette regarding how they interacted with members of the upper class, if they interacted with them at all. Those things weren't in British North America. They weren't a factor of life in the colonies, and yet there were definitely social classes and a social hierarchy in British North America. It just wasn't as explicit as it was back in Europe, and there were not necessarily as many norms or rules regarding the interactions between the different classes, but there were definitely upper classes that dominated the political institutions and the cultural institutions of this society, and that wielded a lot of economic power. And there were definitely lower classes that existed primarily to serve the interests of the ruling class. Again, for example, you have indentured servitude earlier on. Later, you see slavery get entrenched. Um, so the entrenchment of these social divisions, despite technical equality between different groups, at least socially, was also a notable trend to recognize and pay attention to. Kind of moving into economic traits, what's also interesting about this colonial elite governing class is that its members were a bit different depending on the region. In the North, the elites were primarily merchants, whereas in the South, these elites were planters. And the economic backgrounds of the colonial elites indicates that the development of the future United States will fundamentally go down two different paths economically up until we get to the Civil War when they're unified. In the North, you have a definite emphasis economically on the expansion and protection of commerce, while in the South, you have an emphasis on preserving plantation agriculture. So you kind of see that those mindsets, those values, and those priorities are entrenched earlier on in the colonial period. And you see that in the backgrounds of the members of the upper class and the people making the political decisions in those regions. Also important to recognize economically that the colonies enjoyed a pretty high standard of living. The average colonist in British North America had a higher standard of living than the average person back in Europe. And with that higher standard of living, you also start to see the foundations of consumerism in American culture. This notion or this high emphasis on buying things, particularly consumer and luxury goods and things that you don't necessarily need, and how part of being an American, at least culturally, means buying things, consuming things, having access to consumer goods, and having a higher standard of living. And as consumerism is developed over the course of time, particularly again when we see it at its height, arguably after World War II, or honestly, you can just argue that it never really went away. But when we see consumerism at its height, how one's ability to consume even became used as a form of a social distinction, how being able to consume more signified that you were a person of higher rank. But we really see only the seed planted for the development of consumerism in the colonial period, with, again, the average colonist having access to all of these consumer and luxury goods from Britain, and the average colonist wanting them and believing that that these goods were important and played an important role in their lives and their society. Kind of piggybacking off of consumerism, and I haven't really talked about this earlier, but it's something that's also a notable component of the colonies, particularly the middle colonies, and it's what sociologist Max Weber terms the Protestant work ethic. Another good way to illustrate this concept is the Benjamin Franklin quote, "God gives all things to industry." Basically, this notion that people seem to have in British North America, that it was a land of opportunity. That, and this is a view we see reflected in a number of sources like the John Smith source and the Hakluyt source, that there was a lot of economic opportunity here, that there was a lot of potential for someone to have a lot of success. They just had to be willing to work hard for it. So, and that's kind of what when Weber describes the Protestant work ethic, he's talking about this norm in especially American culture where a high value is placed on work. That Americans especially seem to place a heavy value on working hard, that they expect to work hard for long hours, and that kind of part of that stems from a cultural belief or a cultural tradition of getting self-worth from work, from your job. And so taking together, if we look at these trends of this emphasis on hard work, but also this emphasis on consumption and a higher standard of living, we can kind of see that colonial culture was developing in a way where the colonists were expecting and were expected to work hard, but they also expected to be well rewarded for their hard work through an ability to consume a lot. And if you look at American culture as it's developed, especially this notion of what we might call the American dream, those two concepts definitely seem to be at work there. And again, they have their roots in the colonial period of British North America. Then the other major cultural things to pay attention to concern religion. How across the board you have a decline in religiosity as the standard of living went up, as people became more concerned with worldly affairs, particularly their economic opportunities and their standard of living, as well as leisure activities. You have an expansion of leisure activities. And how, at least among the elite, you also have the circulation of ideas from the Enlightenment back in Europe, and how in reaction to this period of, you might say, secularization, or at least declining religious fervor, you have the Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s. As a reaction to it, arguing that Americans need to turn back to tradition and religion. And what that dynamic kind of illustrates is a common trend throughout, if you want to trace the long history of the culture war in American history, how periodically, when you have times of pretty substantial social or cultural change, like in the colonial period, or like in the modernization of the 1920s, or during the period of the 1960s, you have a backlash to that, or rather, there's a portion of the population that gets concerned and freaks out at all this pretty rapid change, and there's a reaction to that. Arguing that that the society needs to kind of put the brakes on and maybe start to cool it and reverse some of these changes to get back to previous or older values, which again we kind of see with the relationship between the declining religiosity and the Great Awakening in British North America. So ultimately, if we're looking at British North America and trying to get a pretty solid picture of it, what should become apparent and what we can see taking form is that one, a lot of trends and traits of American culture and American society, politics, and economics have their roots in British North America in the colonial period, but also how during the colonial period you have these colonies that are developing a sort of dual identity, one where they see themselves as distinctively British, and yet also a culture that is becoming uniquely colonial, or one might say American and un-British. And the conflict between these trends between their identity as British subjects and also as colonists or American colonists are kind of fighting or in conflict. That's a notable sign of what's to come in the latter half of the 1700s with the Revolution. And that's kind of a bit one of the big overarching takeaways. So if you have any questions over any of this, let me know. I'll do my best to clear those up. Again, you have your unit reflection assignment that is due Thursday. You'll have a test over British North America that will be unlocked on Thursday. And yeah, more information about those things will be included on Canvas and released over the rest of the week. So take care, and I'll see you later.